The gravel crunched beneath the tires of the U-Haul as Jessica Rayner pulled onto the long dirt drive that led to the house. Dust billowed out behind the trailer in hazy plumes, briefly obscuring the rolling hills and stubborn prairie grass that surrounded the broken silhouette of what had once been a working farm. Her 13-year-old daughter, Ellie, sat slouched in the passenger seat, earbuds in, eyes glued to her phone screen. In the back seat, Max, just 7, pressed his nose to the window, trying to see past the film of dust to the place they were about to call home. "This is it," Jessica said aloud, as much to herself as to the kids. She rolled to a stop, the U-Haul groaning slightly, and turned off the engine. The house stood like a forgotten storybook, its white paint blistered and peeling, the porch sagging under years of weather, vines crawling over the railings like the hands of time pulling it downward. A few shingles dangled precariously from the roofline, and one of the front windows had been boarded up with plywood. The barn off to the left leaned slightly, as though it were too tired to stand up straight. "It looks haunted," Max whispered. Jessica looked at him in the rearview mirror. "No ghosts here, just a lot of work." Ellie popped out an earbud and squinted at the house. "You sure we're not trespassing?" "This place belonged to my Uncle Hank," Jessica replied, reaching for the folder on the dashboard. Inside were the deed, the keys, and a letter from the county clerk. "It's ours now." She stepped out into the warm spring air, took a deep breath, and let it settle into her bones. Denver, with its traffic, tight schedules, and colder walls, felt a million miles away. Here, the air smelled of earth and distant pine. Here, they would start over. Jessica didn't know much about her Uncle Hank. He'd been a reclusive Army veteran who preferred silence over company and had stopped coming to family holidays before she turned 10. What she did know was that when he passed, he left his land to her, the only family he had left. The letter that arrived at her apartment 3 months earlier was short and simple. "The farm is yours now. Do what you will." 3 months. That's how long it had taken to break the lease on her apartment, sell what little she owned that wouldn't fit in the U-Haul, and finally muster the courage to drive 200 miles into the foothills of Colorado with 2 kids and a dream she wasn't even sure she believed in. They spent the first hour exploring. The inside of the house was no better than the outside, musty, dark, and coated in decades of dust. The floorboards creaked ominously, and a family of raccoons had apparently claimed a corner of the attic. But the bones of the place were good: thick timber walls, real stone fireplace, hand-built shelves and window frames. Her uncle hadn't cared for modern comforts, but he'd built with care. "So," Ellie said, arms crossed, standing in what might have once been the kitchen. "This is our fresh start." Jessica knelt, brushing cobwebs from under the counter. "It doesn't look like much now, but we'll fix it. Together." Max poked his head into a hallway and declared, "I get the room with the window that's not broken." Jessica smiled, despite the ache in her stomach. That optimism. Max still had it. Ellie, though, was going to be the hard one. They hauled sleeping bags and boxes into the least terrifying room, her uncle's old study, which had thick curtains and solid walls. It would be their sleeping quarters until they could get the rest of the house cleaned up. The plumbing groaned to life when she tested the kitchen faucet, and the water ran rusty for a good minute before clearing. Electricity was spotty. Some lights flickered, others didn't come on at all. After a quick meal of sandwiches eaten cross-legged on the living room floor, Jessica tucked the kids in and sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The crickets were already singing, and a barn owl let out a soft hoot somewhere nearby. Despite everything, she felt an unfamiliar tug in her chest. Hope. She was about to head inside when headlights crested the hill. A rusty red pickup truck pulled up, and 2 men stepped out. One was older, wide around the middle, with a square jaw and tan lines that spoke of years spent in the sun. The other was younger, maybe in his late 30s, quiet-eyed and observant. "Evenin'," the older man said, walking up to the porch without invitation. "You the new owner?" Jessica stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. "That's right, Jessica Rayner." "Clyde Rollins," the man said, shaking her hand with a grip like sandpaper. "This here's my boy, Travis." Travis nodded. "Ma'am." Heard someone finally claimed old Hank's place. Didn't expect a lady with kids and a city plate on her truck. Jessica kept her tone even. We're here to stay. Clyde raised a brow. That right? Well, best watch yourself with the water. Hank had a deal with the rest of us. Shared usage. Don't go upsetting things. Jessica frowned. I haven't touched anything. Not yet, Clyde said, tipping his hat. But change brings trouble. You'll see. Without another word, he and Travis climbed back into the truck and drove off, dust rising behind them like a warning. Jessica stood there for a long time, arms crossed, heart beating too fast. Welcome to Briar Glen. The next morning, she took Max into town while Ellie stayed behind, too exhausted and irritated to deal with more introductions. The town of Briar Glen was small, just one main street with a diner, a post office, a gas station, and a general store that also seemed to sell everything from shovels to shoelaces. Inside, the wooden floors creaked and the bell above the door jingled like a scene from a movie. Conversations hushed when she entered. The man behind the counter, tall, wiry, and wearing a denim vest over a plaid shirt, nodded. Help you find something? Jessica smiled. Just grabbing a few basics, cleaning supplies, maybe some chicken wire. My son and I just moved into the old Rayner place. There was a beat of silence. Then the man let out a low whistle. That place is still standing? A short woman with graying hair and a name tag that read Mabel chimed in from the canned goods aisle. Didn't think anyone would come back there. Well, we did, Jessica said, scanning the shelves, and we're going to make it work. When she returned home, Ellie was sitting on the porch steps, arms folded, lips tight. She didn't speak until Jessica unloaded the bags. Someone spray-painted the barn, Ellie said. Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept her chin up. It says, go back to Denver. Jessica felt the air leave her lungs. She dropped the bags, walked to the barn, and saw it for herself. Bright red paint, dripping down the weather-worn wood like blood. She stared at the words for a long time. Then she turned and looked back at her children. Ellie, guarded but strong. Max, clutching a roll of chicken wire. We're not going anywhere, she said, and she meant it. Jessica Rayner's first morning on the farm started with a bang. Literally, somewhere between a rotted support beam and a loose shutter, the wind caught part of the barn door and slammed it shut with such force that Max, halfway through his cereal, yelped and spilled milk across the cracked linoleum. That door's going to be the death of me, Jessica muttered, grabbing a dish towel. She glanced through the kitchen window at the swaying door. It hung crooked, like much of the old farm. Ellie sat silently across the table, picking at a dry piece of toast. She hadn't said much since they arrived. Jessica knew the move had been hardest on her daughter, who'd left behind friends, a school she liked, and the last familiar threads of city life. Max, on the other hand, had already named 3 chickens he'd seen pecking around the overgrown coop. One was Chuck Norris. After breakfast, they bundled up. Colorado Spring was still crisp in the mornings, and headed outside. The plan for the day was simple. Take inventory. What equipment still worked? What buildings were safe to use? What could they afford to fix? The answer to all 3, as it turned out, was not much. The barn's roof had more daylight streaming through than it should. The chicken coop was missing a section of fencing. The greenhouse, though mostly intact, had shattered panes and a mildew problem that made Jessica's eyes water. She sighed, phone in hand, making lists. Back inside, by late afternoon, she sank into a creaky kitchen chair, scrolling through YouTube tutorials on sustainable farming, chicken care, composting, and crop rotation. She was quickly learning that every plan came with 6 complications, but she didn't move here for easy. She moved here for different. 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jessica patched what she could with duct tape, old screws, and stubborn determination. She bought 6 laying hens from a farm up the road and installed a temporary fence using reclaimed wood and leftover chain link she found behind the barn. She even managed to plant a 1/4-acre plot of herbs and salad greens after clearing the ground by hand with a borrowed hoe. Each evening, she cooked over the temperamental gas stove while Max rattled off chicken updates and Ellie grew quieter. Her daughter spent more time on the back porch, sketching in her notebook or watching the sun sink behind the hills. School had started the previous Monday. Ellie came home on that first day with her jaw tight and her earbuds in. "How was it?" Jessica had asked. "Fine." It wasn't. That Friday, a call came from the school counselor. Ellie had been cornered in the hallway by a group of girls who made fun of her hand-me-down jeans and asked if she smelled like goat poop. She hadn't fought back, just walked away. Jessica's stomach twisted as she hung up. She knew kids could be cruel, especially in places like Briar Glen, where new meant not welcome. She wanted to fix it, but she didn't know how. The next day, Jessica went to the local general store to pick up chicken feed and ask about sourcing compost. The place was part feed shop, part hardware store, and part gossip hub. She stepped inside, and conversation slowed like a movie scene. An older man by the register raised an eyebrow. He wore a tan vest with a Briar Glen Farm Association patch. "You the one living up at the old Miller place?" Jessica smiled and nodded. "Jessica Rayner, just getting started." "Huh," the man grunted. "City folk usually don't last long out here." She held her ground. "Well, we'll see about that." Laughter rumbled from behind a row of seed packets. "Tell her to watch the water," someone muttered. "Yeah," another added louder. "Don't go messing with the valley's flow." Jessica didn't respond, but the warning stuck with her. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she walked the perimeter of the chicken yard, double-checking the latch. The hens clucked softly in their roost. Max had named them all by now. Ellie was still withdrawn, but she'd started feeding the birds without being asked. Jessica lingered by the barn, notebook in hand. She scribbled a to-do list. Fix the greenhouse door, rotate compost, call the extension office for soil testing. Headlights flicked across the yard. She squinted. A truck rolled slowly to a stop near the driveway, its engine rumbling low. The driver's side door opened, and a tall man stepped out. He wore a worn hat, boots caked in dust, and a scowl. "Evenin'," he called. Jessica straightened. "Can I help you?" He walked closer, crunching gravel. "Name's Clyde Rollins. My land borders yours on the south side. Just figured I'd drop by and make sure you know what you're doing." Something in his tone bristled. Jessica kept her voice calm. "I'm doing the best I can, Mr. Rollins. Still learning the ropes." "That's so," he said, glancing toward the coop. "Best be careful where your water's coming from. Out here, water rights go back generations. Folks get real testy when lines get crossed." Jessica met his eyes. "I haven't touched anything that isn't mine." Rollins chewed on that for a beat. "Good. Keep it that way." He tipped his hat and turned back to his truck. Gravel spat under the tires as he drove off. Jessica stood frozen, heart pounding. Water rights. She hadn't thought about that. Not yet. That night, the wind howled through the hills. Ellie was restless. Max had a bad dream. Jessica got up twice to check the coop. At dawn, the sky was tinged with pink when she stepped outside and found the coop gate swinging open. 2 hens were gone, feathers scattered along the dirt path. But what caught her attention first were the tire tracks, fresh ones, cutting through the side field. And they led straight toward Clyde Rollins's fence line, her hands clenched into fists. Whatever goodwill she might have had left for this town was wearing thin. But quitting wasn't an option. She'd come too far for that. Before the cracked soil, the sagging porch, and the endless uphill climb, there was silence. Jessica Rayner remembered it well, the kind of silence that comes after a bomb goes off, the kind that sits inside your chest when your identity is stripped bare. That was the day she walked out of the downtown Denver high-rise with a cardboard box in her arms and 16 years of loyalty reduced to a severance check and a best of luck. She hadn't planned to become a farmer. Farming was something her Uncle Ray had done in distant postcards and infrequent Thanksgiving phone calls. But when the job disappeared and her lease expired the same week, her savings had offered no real cushion, only enough for gas, moving expenses, and a future that hadn't yet taken shape. Why not? She had asked herself one night after putting Max to bed and watching Ellie stare blankly at a TV show she'd once loved. Why not the farm? That question became the spark. A few weeks later, they were on the road. Now, standing in the kitchen of the decrepit farmhouse, she stared at the thin trickle of water sputtering from the faucet. She twisted the handle, but the groan of the pipes was the only reply. "Mom, the toilet won't flush again," Ellie called from down the hall. "Try the bucket," Jessica replied, sighing. Max poked his head in. "Can I use the tape to fix the chicken sign?" "You can. Just make sure the letters are still readable." It had been a week of little wins and big messes. The electricity had stabilized mostly. The kitchen now had one working burner and a refrigerator that no longer smelled like rotting produce. The chicken coop had been patched, barely, using an old door and some recycled wire fencing. The small raised bed she dug into the side yard was now full of dark compost and sprouting signs of green. Jessica knew better than to expect miracles, but something about seeing the fragile curve of a sprout pushing through the soil did something to her. It whispered, maybe. That same afternoon, a rickety old Subaru with U.S. Postal Service markings rattled up the gravel driveway. Out stepped a woman in her 70s, all wiry limbs and floral blouse, with a face weathered like dry parchment, but bright eyes full of spark. "May Holloway," the woman announced before Jessica could speak. Mail carrier, gossip gatherer, seed saver. Jessica grinned, despite her exhaustion. Jessica Rayner, newcomer, house fixer, chicken herder. May chuckled. "Well, we already got something in common. Neither of us can afford a decent title." From the passenger seat, she pulled out a crate that looked older than both women combined. Inside were dozens of paper packets, hand-labeled with names like Aunt Della's pole beans and Elkin's family kale. "These here," May said, setting the box on the porch, "are your second chance, saved from the best growers Briar Glen ever knew. I figured you might like a jump start." Jessica crouched next to the box, gently thumbing through the seed packets like they were ancient texts. "I don't know how to thank you." "Just don't quit after the first storm," May said, her voice softening. "You're stubborn, girl. I can see it. That might just save you." May returned to her car without waiting for a thank you, the mail truck kicking up dust as it disappeared back toward the paved road. Inside, Ellie was cleaning the chicken coop voluntarily. Jessica blinked. "You all right?" "I guess," Ellie shrugged. "They're kind of dumb, but I like watching them peck around. It's relaxing." Jessica nodded, letting the moment breathe. Later that night, Ellie mentioned she stood up for herself at school. A group of 8th grade girls had made a crack about her muddy boots. "I told them at least my shoes aren't made from child labor," Ellie said casually over dinner, and Jessica nearly choked on her lentils. Max, on the other hand, had become deeply invested in naming all 12 chickens. He carried around a battered notebook filled with drawings and behavioral notes. "Henrietta pecks the most. She's kind of the boss," he said solemnly one morning. "She sounds like a real CEO," Jessica joked. "What's a CEO?" "Someone who makes a lot of money by giving other people too much work." He nodded, scribbling CEO next to Henrietta's name. Jessica spent every available moment researching. She watched YouTube tutorials late into the night about greenhouse construction, composting techniques, and permaculture layouts. She reread the seed packets May had given her, marking notes in a binder she called The Manual for the Impossible. It took 2 weeks to clear out the greenhouse. Under layers of dust and broken glass panes, the structure still had bones. She scrubbed the algae off the interior, patched the leaks, and laid down fresh gravel. The day she placed her first tray of seedlings beneath the sun-warmed windows, she whispered a silent prayer to anyone who might be listening. 3 days later, Max ran in screaming, "They're growing! Mom, the baby plants are growing!" Jessica dropped her tool belt and sprinted outside. Sure enough, pale green shoots were poking through the soil, tiny signs of life, delicate but defiant. She felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, not from sadness or frustration, but from something else entirely. Hope. Later that night, she found Ellie sitting in the kitchen, sketching out an idea for a herb spiral garden. The windows were open, and the smell of fresh tilled soil wafted in with the spring breeze. Max was asleep on the couch, his notebook clutched in one arm. "Mom?" Ellie said without looking up. "Do you think we'll actually make this work?" Jessica looked around the room, the patched floorboards, the cracked counters, the seedlings glowing under their grow light. "I think we already are." Outside, the stars hung over Briar Glen, like sequins sewn into a velvet sky. The farm was still broken, still struggling, but it was breathing again, and so were they. Jessica whispered it aloud this time, for herself. We're going to make it. And somewhere, in the dark soil of a forgotten field, roots were taking hold. It started with the wind, the kind of wind that made doors slam and old trees groan. On an otherwise bright spring morning, the blue sky over Briar Glen gave way to an eerie gray, and by afternoon, a violent windstorm swept through the valley like something from a Dust Bowl tale. Jessica stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing the dirt from a bunch of radishes, when the first loud crack split the air. She barely had time to step onto the porch before she saw one of the old cottonwoods near the barn snap and crash through the chicken coop fence, sending hens squawking in every direction. Max ran out after her, barefoot and wide-eyed. "Is it a tornado?" "No, sweetheart," Jessica said, pulling him close. "Just a mean wind." The power went out 20 minutes later. By sundown, they'd rounded up most of the chickens, though 2 remained missing. The greenhouse plastic had been partially torn loose. The west-facing gutter had flown off the roof like a sheet of paper, and their refrigerator full of prepped seedlings, food, and medication had already begun to sweat in the rising heat. Jessica sat at the dining table in the dim candlelight that night, arms wrapped around her shoulders, as Ellie and Max spooned warm beans from a pot heated on the propane camp stove. "It could have been worse," Ellie said softly. Jessica smiled faintly, appreciating the effort. "Yeah, it could have." Still, the next morning, the scent of rot from the spoiled food was overwhelming. The freezer had defrosted overnight, ruining pounds of produce and meat they'd managed to save since arriving. Her shoulders ached from the cleanup, her hands scraped and red from repairs she wasn't trained to make, and the small emergency fund she'd set aside was nearly gone. As she was dragging the last trash bag to the curb, her foot kicked something solid near the back of the barn. Half buried beneath weeds and an overturned crate was a metal toolbox. She tugged it free, brushed off the rust, and opened the latch with a grunt. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and time, was a thick, leather-bound notebook. Its cover had the initials H.R. Henry Rayner, her uncle's journal. Jessica carried it inside, sat cross-legged on the floor, and slowly flipped through its pages. There were detailed notes on crop rotations from the 80s, irrigation maps, and pages of handwritten weather observations spanning over 20 years. And then, near the back, a sketched map she didn't recognize. It showed the outline of the farm, but there was an area marked with an X near a rocky outcrop by the east fence line, labeled simply Alternative. Well, 1997. Tested. Pure. Jessica stared at the page, heart thudding. Her uncle had found a secondary water source, one he'd never mentioned in his will, nor in any legal documentation she'd reviewed. She didn't wait. That afternoon, she hiked out to the location with a spade and a trowel, Ellie trailing behind her out of curiosity. Max had fallen asleep in a patch of sun with a chicken in his lap, his notebook open to a page titled, "Henrietta, likes oats, hates loud noises." The rocky outcrop was overgrown, but after a few hours of careful clearing, they found it. An old, rust-covered well cap, hidden beneath scrub and ivy. The hand crank was gone, but the casing looked intact. Jessica took photos, checked the depth with a rope and weight, and estimated it hadn't been used in decades. By nightfall, she was on the phone with the nearest county water expert who handled rural testing and certification. It cost more than she wanted to spend, but it was an investment. He arrived 2 days later in a dusty red truck, his business card reading, "Marty Wells, Rural Water and Soil Tech." A sun-creased man with a straightforward way of talking, Marty spent a full afternoon testing, measuring, and reviewing soil samples. "You might have something here," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Water table's deep but clean. Damn clean, actually. Nitrate levels are low, mineral balance is excellent. If this well's legit and predates Clyde Rawlins' permit boundaries, you've got an ace in your back pocket." Jessica blinked. Why would it matter if it predates his boundary? Marty raised an eyebrow. "You haven't heard? Rawlins controls the water permit office for this county. He's been known to invalidate claims he sees as in conflict with his interests. Lots of farms have just given up trying." Jessica's stomach twisted. "But if my uncle documented this back in '97? Then you've got proof it existed before Rollins' reign. That could give you grandfathered rights if you file now and play it smart. Jessica felt like she could breathe for the first time in weeks. Thank you, Marty. He nodded. I'll get you a certified report by Monday, but I'd keep this quiet till then. Don't give anyone a reason to get nosy. Jessica promised she would, but her relief was short-lived. The next morning, as she and Max were walking toward the coop, a shadow fell over them. Clyde Rollins. He sat in his shiny black pickup at the property line, arms folded, sunglasses on. Jessica walked to the edge of the road, keeping Max behind her. Morning, she said coolly. Clyde didn't respond right away. He just looked her over, his gaze sweeping from her work gloves to the mud on her jeans. Funny thing, he said at last, voice slow and low. Heard you've been poking around where you shouldn't. Just remember, Miss Rayner, there's a balance out here in the valley. You stir the water too much, things break. She stared at him, feeling that tight knot of defiance grow in her chest. I'm just fixing up my land, she said, nothing more. Clyde leaned forward. That land's got history, and not all of it belongs to you, no matter what you think. He turned his key, and the engine growled to life. As the dust from his tires clouded the gravel road, Jessica felt Max slip his hand into hers. Mom, he whispered, I don't like that man. Jessica squeezed his hand. Me either, baby. But don't worry. We're not going anywhere. Later that evening, she pulled out her uncle's journal again. She traced the X over the hidden well and smiled, just a little. She'd found a secret the land had been holding on to, and maybe, just maybe, it was about to save everything. The Colorado sun rose early that Saturday morning, casting golden light across the neglected fields of what was slowly becoming Hope Acre. Jessica Rayner stood on the sagging porch, hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug filled with lukewarm coffee. The scent of damp earth and wild grass drifted on the breeze, stirring something old but hopeful deep inside her. Today was the day. She wasn't waiting anymore. Today they'd put something in the ground. Ellie stepped out behind her, rubbing sleep from her eyes and adjusting the oversized hoodie she'd swiped from a box of donations Jessica had hauled from Denver. You really think anything will grow in that field? She asked, nodding toward the back acre Jessica had been clearing for 2 weeks. Jessica took a slow sip. I do, but only if we give it everything we got. The quarter acre had been choked with thistle, cheatgrass, and wild mustard when they arrived. With help from Ellie, Max, and YouTube tutorials, Jessica had hacked away at it, borrowed a weed whacker from a cautious neighbor, and pulled rocks from the soil until her arms ached. It was far from perfect, but the rows had been tilled by hand, and the compost bin had finally started to yield something that smelled more like soil than refuse. Their planting plan was simple, ambitious, and probably naive. Jessica had picked up packets of rainbow carrot seeds, heirloom tomatoes, lavender, and calendula from the local feed store. The clerk, a teenager with a mullet and a name tag that read Kyle, had looked at her like she'd asked where they kept the unicorn food. But that hadn't stopped her. She saw something different in the dirt. Potential. And this morning, it wasn't just about plants. It was about planting hope. Max came bouncing out of the house, still in pajama pants and rain boots, dragging his chicken logbook under one arm and a dented watering can under the other. I already checked the hens. Egg count is up to 8 today, he called, beaming. Jessica grinned. That's great, buddy. Want to help me plant the carrots? Can I use the dibbler? She chuckled. If you remember to actually plant the seeds after. By mid-morning, the trio was in full swing. Ellie took the tomato seedlings and gently nestled them into the rows Jessica had marked with string and stakes. Max made holes with his wooden dibbler and covered the tiny rainbow carrot seeds with careful handfuls of earth. Jessica focused on the lavender and calendula, spacing the rows wide enough for future harvest and hopeful walkways. Sweat trickled down Jessica's neck as she worked. Her knees ached, her back screamed, and the sun was relentless. But she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Here, in the dirt, with her kids by her side, she felt grounded. Late afternoon brought a surprise rumble of an old Ford pickup rolling up the drive. Jessica looked up from her knees, wiping her hands on her jeans. The truck coughed to a stop, and out stepped Jonah Brooks, tall, tan, and a little shy-looking in his worn flannel shirt and grease-smudged jeans. "Hey," he said, lifting a hand. "Heard you were fixing up the Rayner place." Jessica stood and gave a wary smile. "Trying to, slowly. The tractor's still dead, been pulling rocks and tilling by hand." Jonah scratched the back of his neck. "I was friends with your uncle, fixed his truck more times than I can count. He let his tractor rust to hell, but I think it's salvageable." Her heart jumped. "You think so?" He nodded. "If you don't mind me poking around under the hood, I might get it running. Could be a good start." Jessica stepped aside and gestured to the rusted hunk of metal sitting under a sagging lean-to. "Be my guest. I'll trade you a dozen eggs and some gratitude." He chuckled. "Deal." As Jonah popped the hood and muttered to himself, Max hovered close, fascinated by the tools. Ellie eyed him cautiously, but when he showed her how to check spark plugs, her curiosity piqued. For the first time, Jessica saw her daughter actually engaged with something other than her phone. By early evening, they'd gotten almost the whole field planted. Jonah stayed for dinner, a humble stir-fry of vegetables from a neighbor's roadside stand and eggs from their hens. They ate on the porch, the sun melting into the hills. Jonah leaned back in his chair, cradling a lemonade. "You know, most folks around here are just waiting for you to give up," he said without malice. Jessica nodded. "Yeah, I noticed. Someone spray-painted our barn, told us to go back to Denver." "Yeah, that was Clyde's nephew, most likely." "That family thinks they own this valley, but not everyone feels the same. Some of us are just waiting to see what you'll do." Jessica met his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere. I didn't come here to play farmer. I came to build something real." Jonah nodded. "Then you've already made it farther than most." That night, after the kids were asleep, Jessica sat at the kitchen table with a spiral notebook open, listing every task still to do: fix the pump, build better fencing, find buyers. Her pen hovered, then she added, "survive July." The next morning brought something unexpected. A local blogger, Lila Hayes, who ran a modest site about rural living, showed up with a camera and a keen eye. "Saw your market booth," she said. "Folks are talking. You mind if I do a piece on you?" Jessica hesitated but nodded. "Sure, as long as you don't mind chicken poop in your boots." The article went live 3 days later. City mom plants roots in Briar Glen can hope grow on rocky soil. It featured pictures of Ellie planting tomatoes, Max journaling with chickens in the background, and Jessica in dirt-streaked jeans, smiling with fierce determination. Orders started trickling in through email. A woman from a B&B asked about edible flowers. A small cafe in Grand Junction wanted a weekly box of mixed produce, but the biggest surprise came in the form of a voicemail on Jessica's battered cell phone. "Hi, this is Chef Anthony Daly from East Pine Kitchen in Denver. I read about your farm and your heirloom crops. Any chance you can deliver weekly harvest by July? We pay top dollar for clean, sustainably grown produce. Call me back." Jessica played the message twice before calling Ellie and Max into the room. "Kids, we got a shot at something big." Max grinned. "Like a real restaurant?" Ellie raised an eyebrow. "Think we can keep up?" Jessica smiled. "We're sure as heck gonna try." Outside, the first green shoots pushed through the tilled rows, reaching for the sun. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the distant pines when Jessica stepped out onto the porch with a mug of lukewarm coffee and a growing sense of optimism. The lavender buds were starting to peek out from their silver foliage. The rainbow carrots were germinating in neat rows thanks to the drip lines she and Jonah had rigged together. Ellie and Max were still asleep, and the farm, for the moment, was calm. But, as the saying went in, Briar Glen. If the morning starts quiet, better keep your boots close. It might not stay that way for long. Sure enough, just as Jessica finished her coffee and headed for the greenhouse to check on the seedlings, she noticed something off. The water pressure in the spigot was barely a trickle. "Not again," she muttered. She jogged down to the well housing with a wrench tucked under her arm. The pump was groaning, worse than usual. Jessica squatted down, removed the panel, and stared in dismay at the corroded components. By noon, the pump gave up entirely. The repair estimate from the only available technician in the region was a gut punch. $2,300. Jessica stood by the kitchen counter, staring at the number scrawled on the back of a feed receipt. Her entire monthly budget was barely that. Jonah came by after his work at the co-op feed mill and took one look at the setup. "That's not just wear and tear," he said, crouching beside the dead pump. "Looks like someone's been messing with this." Jessica blinked. "What do you mean?" He pointed at the wiring. "These leads were clean 2 weeks ago. This looks like it was nicked on purpose, just enough to fry the unit over time." Jessica's jaw clenched. Her thoughts flashed to Clyde Rawlins. She hadn't seen him since the water board hearing, but he'd always had a way of lingering. Through rumors, through threats, and now, apparently, sabotage. That evening, the tension was thick inside the farmhouse. Ellie slumped at the kitchen table, a bruise forming under her eye. She'd gotten into a fight at school after another student mocked their weed farm and said they should go back to the city. "You okay?" Jessica asked gently. "Yeah," Ellie replied, poking at her dinner. "He said we're just playing pretend, and it's only a matter of time before this whole place falls apart. So I told him to shut up, and when he didn't, I made him." Jessica sat beside her and put a hand on her daughter's. "Violence isn't the answer, but I'm proud of you for standing your ground. We're not going anywhere." Max, ever quiet during tense moments, slid a folded note across the table. Jessica opened it. Inside was a $500 bill and a scribbled line in handwriting she didn't recognize. "Keep going." Jessica's hands trembled. "Where'd you find this?" "In the farm stand cooler," Max said. "I was putting the egg cartons out, and it was just sitting there in a little envelope." There was no name, no return address, just the money and the words. Jessica stared at the note long after dinner was cleared. Part of her wanted to believe it was someone in town softening. Maybe Martha, the librarian who'd stopped by last week to ask about fresh thyme. Or maybe even Bill from the hardware store, who'd been gruff, but not unkind. But deep down, she suspected the help had come from someone more unexpected. "Could have been one of Jonah's homesteader friends," Ellie offered when Jessica shared her theory. "They're always dropping by with buckets of compost and spare fence wire." "Maybe," Jessica murmured, "but either way, it means someone believes in what we're doing here." The next morning, Jonah returned with a small group of off-grid homesteaders, men and women who looked like they'd stepped out of a survivalist guide, each with dirt under their nails and practical wisdom in their eyes. One of them, a woman named Tara with sun-bleached braids and a tattered trucker hat, examined the dead pump. "We can fix it," she said. "Might not be pretty, but it'll pump." Jessica hesitated. "Even if the parts are fried?" "I got a parts graveyard at my place, old RVs, tractors, solar rigs. Stuff nobody wants, but I keep just in case. You'd be surprised what we can cobble together." Within hours, they had a makeshift repair underway. The chatter among the group was easy, warm, and focused. Ellie handed out lemonade. Max gave everyone a tour of the chicken coop. By sunset, the pump roared back to life. Jessica almost cried. "What do I owe you?" she asked Jonah as the others loaded up their gear. "Nothing," he said. "But if you're serious about this operation, you might consider joining the network. We trade skills and supplies instead of cash. Compost, eggs, veggies, even favors like child watching or help during planting. It's not charity, it's community." Jessica thought of the hundreds she owed on her credit card, the feed bill coming due, and the ghost of Clyde looming large over the town's permits office. "I'm in." That weekend, she drove to the county clerk's office to double-check her well rights, only to find her file missing from the front records. The clerk, a nervous young man named Vince, fumbled when she asked. It's probably misfiled," he said. "Or in the archives." "You mean the archives that haven't been digitized? The ones Clyde Rawlins used to oversee before he retired?" Vince didn't answer. Jessica left with a pit in her stomach. Back home, she pulled out her uncle's journal. There were notes in his cramped handwriting about the well's original depth and coordinates. There was even a sketch of a second, deeper spring, marked only with a red X. "Max," she called, "you still got your measuring rope and compass?" Her son bounded down the stairs. "Yeah. Why?" She handed him the map. "We've got something to find." They hiked the property's southern edge, where overgrown scrub gave way to a dry creek bed. After 20 minutes of navigating brambles and patches of stinging nettle, Max stopped. "Here," he said, "we're on the mark." Jessica looked down. A patch of moss-covered rocks surrounded a caved-in wooden frame, almost entirely swallowed by time. "It's a second well," she whispered. By sundown, Jonah and the homesteaders were back, and by flashlight, they tested the water. The readings showed low nitrate levels, stable pH, and the cleanest water they'd seen in the region. "Jessica," Tara said, clapping her on the back, "you just found liquid gold." But Jessica wasn't smiling, because she knew that once word got out, Clyde Rawlins wouldn't just try to bury her paperwork, he'd come at her with everything he had, and next time, it wouldn't be just the pump they'd be fixing. Jessica stood at the edge of the field, the breeze ruffling her ponytail, as she stared out at the rows of lavender she and the kids had planted just weeks before. The scent was faint but promising, the flowers still young but stretching skyward, defying the rocky soil of Briar Glen. The new irrigation pump ticked in rhythm from the greenhouse, a steady mechanical heartbeat reminding her of how fragile all of this still was. It had taken 3 weekends of repairs, hours of help from the off-grid homesteaders, and nearly every dollar in her dwindling savings. But the water was flowing again. Just barely. Jonah pulled up in his faded blue truck, dust curling behind him in the late morning sun. He climbed out with a tired smile, holding 2 iced teas in mason jars. "You look like you need this more than I do," he said, handing one over. Jessica accepted it gratefully, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. "Thanks," she said. "The lavender's finally starting to come in, and the heirlooms are showing flower clusters. That chef in Denver is expecting his first order in 4 weeks." Jonah took a sip and looked out over the land. "You've done more in 3 months than some folks do in 3 years. Jessica gave a tired chuckle. "That's only because I'm scared if I stop moving, it'll all fall apart." He gave her a sideways look, then reached into his back pocket and handed her a folded envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a land permit application. "Clyde's been trying to get your irrigation rights reviewed," Jonah said. "Found this tacked up at the county office." Jessica's eyes scanned the document. Clyde Rawlins had filed a claim suggesting her water usage infringed on the upstream flow that supplied the Rawlins ranch. "That's not true," she said sharply. "The well is completely separate. He knows that." "Yeah, he knows. Doesn't mean he cares. He's playing dirty now." Jessica's hands clenched the paper. Her well had tested cleaner than most in the valley. It had been untouched for decades, likely shielded by her uncle's reclusive habits. But if Clyde managed to convince the water board that she was in violation, they could suspend her irrigation permit while it was under review. And that would mean no water, no crops, no income. "This is retaliation," she muttered, "because I wouldn't cave to his bullying." Jonah nodded. "He's been doing this to folks for years. You're just the first one to fight back." Jessica exhaled slowly. "Then we fight back, with facts, with the law, with everything I've got." 3 days later, Jessica stood before the county water board in a stuffy room lined with folding chairs and faded flags. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through her binder of documentation. Maps, test results, historical data, even pages from her uncle's old journal showing the original well layout. The board members, 5 in total, sat behind a long table, their expressions ranging from bored to skeptical. Clyde Rawlins sat 2 rows back in the audience, arms folded, his smug expression daring her to try. Jonah was at her side, along with May Holloway, who insisted on attending despite the early hour. Ellie sat quietly near the back with Max, both holding their notebooks like talismans. Jessica cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I'm here to contest the challenge to my irrigation rights filed by Mr. Clyde Rawlins. I inherited the Rayner property from my uncle, Thomas Rayner, who dug the well over 40 years ago. It has never drawn from the same aquifer as the Rawlins property. I have water quality tests, geological surveys, and historic usage logs to prove this." She clicked her laptop to project the first image on the screen. A hand-drawn map from her uncle's journal, now overlaid with digital topographical data. The presentation lasted 20 minutes. She ended with a sample report from the water expert she'd hired, showing the well's recharge source came from a separate underground channel than Clyde's water. Silence followed. One board member leaned in. "Ms. Rayner, we appreciate the detail, but Mr. Rollins has claimed your increased use is impacting water table levels." Jessica nodded. "Respectfully, sir, his claims are speculative. Mine are backed by data. I'm happy to have a neutral third-party hydrologist evaluate both properties." From the corner of the room, Clyde snorted. "This is a hobby farm. She's not even from here." May Holloway stood slowly. "That hobby farmer has done more for this town's integrity in 3 months than some have in 30 years. A ripple went through the room. Jonah stepped up next. "I used to work for Rollins," he said. "I left because I saw how he bent the rules and pressured neighbors. Ms. Rayner's farm is clean. Her well is clean. Her operation deserves a fair chance." Jessica looked around the room, her throat tight. "I didn't come to Briar Glen to make enemies. I came to raise my children and grow something honest. All I ask is the same respect you'd give any other farmer in this county." The board called a short recess. Jessica sat with Jonah and May, her nerves fraying. Max whispered, "You did good, Mom," and handed her a drawing he'd made, a cartoon version of their farm with smiling chickens and purple lavender rows. 10 minutes later, the board returned. "In light of the documentation presented, the Briar Glen Water Authority hereby affirms Ms. Rayner's irrigation rights under the existing agricultural usage clause. The challenge by Mr. Rollins is dismissed." A wave of relief hit her so hard she nearly slumped in her chair. Ellie clapped quietly. Jonah patted her shoulder. Clyde stormed out. The next afternoon, Jessica stood in the greenhouse sorting seedlings when a teacher from Ellie's school arrived. "Hi there. I just wanted to drop off something. Ellie submitted this for the spring showcase." She handed over a folded piece of paper, Ellie's poem titled "The Farm We Grew." It was simple but powerful, and apparently it had won first prize. Jessica wiped her eyes as she read it aloud to Max. "We came from a city to where the wind hums low. With broken boards and rusted bolts, we planted seeds to grow. People laughed and walked away, said dreams don't bloom out here. But roots ran deep beneath the soil, fed not by doubt, but cheer." That night, Jessica pinned the poem next to the front door. The wind outside carried the soft scent of lavender and the faint sound of chickens settling in. She had won the battle for water, but more than that, she had planted something even deeper, respect, and it was starting to take root. The late June sun poured gold over the hills of Briar Glen, but at Hope Acre, Jessica Rayner couldn't enjoy it. She stood in the middle of her greenhouse, hands streaked with soil and sweat dripping down her back as she mentally counted the hours left. 48. That's all she had to prepare for a surprise inspection triggered by an anonymous complaint. Code violations, food safety concerns, possible contamination from non-certified compost. The county inspector had read from his clipboard over the phone with the clipped tone of someone used to delivering bad news. "We'll be out in 2 days." Jessica had barely hung up the call before her knees buckled beneath her. 1,000 thoughts crashed over her like a tidal wave. Who had reported her? Clyde Rollins was the obvious answer. No one else had the motive. She clenched her fists. He wasn't just trying to push her out of the valley now. He was trying to discredit everything she'd worked for. But she didn't have time to wallow in anger. She snapped into action. She started in the greenhouse, where the floor was cluttered with tools, seedling trays, and scattered compost bags. The inspection notice gave her a checklist a mile long: sanitation, labeling, record-keeping, animal housing standards, irrigation safety, compost origin documentation. She worked well into the evening, flashlight strapped to her forehead, clearing, scrubbing, organizing. Ellie helped after school, wiping down the farm stand refrigerator with vinegar and checking dates on every jar and container. Max took the chicken coop, marching around with a pencil tucked behind his ear and a clipboard that made him look like a tiny foreman. He documented every egg collected, every feed scoop poured, and each water container cleaned. "We're not going to let some grumpy old man take our chickens," he declared, scribbling numbers furiously. "These girls are certified adorable." Despite the tension, Jessica couldn't help but laugh. The next morning, Jonah Brooks pulled into the driveway, climbing out of his old Chevy with a cooler of sandwiches and 2 folding tables. Heard you're in the middle of a fire drill, he said, offering a smile and handing her a turkey and cheddar on rye. Figured you could use an extra set of hands. Jessica took the sandwich gratefully. They're inspecting everything. If the farm fails, I lose co-op eligibility. Jonah looked around, taking in the freshly stacked crates, scrubbed greenhouse shelves, and signs Max had made with marker and cardboard. Wash hands before touching plants. You're not going to fail, he said. You've done more with this place in a few months than some folks do in years. Together they replaced broken boards on the chicken run, organized the tool shed, and reviewed Jessica's business ledger. Later that evening, they sat on the porch drinking sweet tea as the sun dipped low. Why do you help so much? Jessica asked, her voice soft. Jonah glanced out at the fields. Because I believe in second chances. And maybe because I used to be part of the problem. Jessica looked at him, surprised. Jonah sighed. I worked for Clyde Rollins up until a couple years ago. Thought I was building something that mattered. Then I saw how he treated his workers, especially the migrants. Unsafe housing, late pay, no respect. I spoke up, got told to pack my things. He chuckled bitterly. Hard to walk away from steady work, but it was the right thing. Jessica nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. The next morning arrived with a chill in the air despite the summer sun. Jessica wore her best flannel shirt, tied her hair back, and gathered Ellie and Max for a pep talk. We know this farm. We believe in what we're doing. Just be yourselves, be honest, and let the work speak for itself. The county inspection van rolled up at 9:02 a.m. A middle-aged man with a clipboard stepped out, followed by a younger woman with a camera and a notebook. I'm Craig Hollister, the man said, shaking Jessica's hand. And this is Amanda. We're from the Regional Agricultural Health and Safety Division. Jessica led them through the property. They examined the greenhouse first, snapping photos of labeled seed trays, organic certified compost bags, and the tidy storage shelves. Craig scribbled notes. You grow your own seedlings? Yes, we use a mix of coconut coir and compost, all from certified sources. Amanda raised an eyebrow as she examined the farm stand. Who tracks your poultry data? Max stepped forward proudly. I do. I can show you the logs. He flipped through his notebook, pointing out charts with dates, egg counts, and health notes. The inspector actually smiled. Impressive, Craig said. Not many operations this size keep such detailed records. The coop passed inspection. Water was clean. Feed was stored in airtight containers. No signs of rodent activity. Next came the compost pile. Jessica braced herself. Craig took a long sniff, then nodded. Smells like good breakdown. Heat levels? We log it daily, Ellie said, handing him a binder. He flipped through the charts, then handed it back. Very thorough. By noon, the tour wrapped. The inspectors conferred quietly for a few minutes, while Jessica, Ellie, Max, and Jonah waited by the porch, hearts pounding. Craig finally approached with a small smile. You passed, he said simply, with commendations. Your record-keeping, animal care, and hygiene standards are well above average. We'll be issuing full certification. You're eligible for the co-op distributor program immediately. Jessica's knees buckled again, but this time from relief. After the van drove off, she slumped into a chair, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Max hugged her waist. Told you our chickens were adorable. Ellie grinned. Now we can ship to Denver. Jonah raised a glass of lemonade. To Hope Acre, officially certified and kicking expectations in the teeth. Jessica clinked her glass against his, the taste of victory even sweeter than the lemonade. That night, as the stars glittered over the Colorado plains, she stood on the porch and stared out at the land, a land that had once seemed broken beyond repair, now quietly coming back to life. Hope wasn't just the name of her farm anymore. It was the feeling that lived in every row, every egg, every sprout, and in the hearts of the family who had built it with grit, tears, and more love than they ever thought they had to give. And something told her this was only the beginning. The sun peeked over the ridge, painting the fields of Briar Glen in amber and gold. Jessica Rayner stood on her porch, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands, watching the mist lift from the rows of green that now stretched proudly across her once weedy acreage. The hum of bees from the lavender beds filled the morning air, and the scent of tomato vines clung to the breeze. After months of struggle, setbacks, and uncertainty, it was finally here. Harvest season. "You ready, Mom?" Ellie called, already dressed in her work boots and flannel, her ponytail looped tight. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement. Max, slightly behind her, clutched a clipboard in one hand and a straw hat that kept slipping over his eyes in the other. "As ready as I'll ever be," Jessica replied, setting her mug down and tightening the laces on her boots. They had a long list to tackle, pulling carrots, picking tomatoes, bundling herbs, washing, sorting, packing. And they weren't doing it alone. Jonah Brooks arrived early, as he always did now, pulling up in his beat-up Ford with a grin and 2 thermoses of coffee. One for him, one for her. He brought more than caffeine. He brought muscle, experience, and a steadiness Jessica had come to count on. By mid-morning, the off-grid homesteaders arrived, each of them bringing something different to the table. Maya with her sorting crates, Hector and Lou with their impeccable stacking system, and Gretchen with her vintage scale that somehow still worked perfectly. "It's like a miracle," Maya said as she picked through a bin of rainbow carrots, holding up one with a perfect spiral twist. "You sure you're not hiding some secret fertilizer recipe in that greenhouse of yours?" Jessica laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just compost, patience, and prayer." The farm stand filled with crates, heirloom tomatoes in every shade from dusky pink to golden yellow, bunches of lavender wrapped with twine, glossy eggplants, zucchini, and peppers so red they looked painted. The chalkboard sign read, "First Harvest Special, everything grown with heart, hands, and hope." By noon, the first customers trickled in. Locals at first, curious townsfolk who'd once muttered about that city woman. Martha from the bakery came for basil. Ned, the school janitor, picked up a bag of greens. Then came the chef's delivery van from Denver. The driver, a 20-something with a nose ring and an apron, beamed when Jessica handed over the pre-packed crates. "Chef Roland said to tell you he's building next week's menu around your tomatoes," he said, loading them with care. He's never been this excited about vegetables. Jessica blinked, stunned. Chef Roland ran one of the trendiest restaurants in the city. Hearing her produce would feature on his plates was surreal. Back at the school, Ellie was finally being seen for more than just the new girl. After winning first prize for her farm poem, her classmates treated her differently. Even her English teacher, Mrs. Pollard, came by the stand that afternoon, buying herbs and offering a ride home from school any day. Ellie needed it. Max, with his ever-present clipboard, handled egg sales like a young entrepreneur, explaining to customers how pasture-raised hens laid better-tasting eggs. He even started naming their top layers, Henrietta, Marigold, and Featherfoot. That evening, as they packed up the day's unsold produce for donation, Clyde Rawlins' cousin, Barry, ambled up the drive. The man was quiet, heavy-set, with a face permanently weathered by sun and squinting suspicion. "Got a minute?" he asked. Jessica nodded cautiously. "Clyde, he's been telling folks you were wrecking the soil, growing nonsense crops, but I had one of your tomatoes from the diner. It was the best thing I've eaten in years." He scratched the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong to judge. You've done something real here." He extended a calloused hand. Jessica took it. That night, after dinner, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. Jonah handed Jessica a piece of wood, freshly carved and sanded. "Thought your farm could use a proper sign," he said. Burned into the grain were the words, "Hope Acre." Jessica traced the letters with her fingers, tears rising unbidden. "You built more than a farm here, Jess," he said quietly. "You built a place people believe in." As the stars came out over Briar Glen, Jessica looked over the rows of growing life, the chickens softly clucking in their coop, the barn lights glowing like fireflies. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving, and the harvest had only just begun. The morning sun cast a golden haze over the rolling fields of Briar Glen as the town prepared for the annual Fall Harvest Festival. Banners fluttered from the lampposts along Main Street, and the scent of cinnamon and apple cider floated through the crisp October air. Booths were already set up by the time Jessica pulled into the parking lot of the town square with her rusty pickup, the flatbed loaded with crates of produce. Her once silent neighbors now greeted her with waves and smiles. Her kids, Ellie and Max, were buzzing with excitement in the back seat. "Remember," Jessica called out as she opened the tailgate, "we set up by the gazebo next to the Jenkins honey booth. Max, you're on tomatoes. Ellie, the sign and payment table." They had it down to a science now. The produce stand, neatly stacked with heirloom vegetables, striped tomatoes, purple carrots, and golden beets, was a vibrant splash of color. Max arranged everything in perfect rows with a kind of reverent precision, and Ellie hung the banner that read, "Hope Acre Farm." She'd drawn it herself, and the name had stuck since it was first uttered by a customer at the Saturday market months ago. Jessica stepped back to take it in. The sun caught the dew on the produce, making everything sparkle. She could hardly believe how far they'd come. Just months ago, she'd been a city woman with 2 kids and a rundown farm no one believed in. Now, she was part of the community, a respected grower with steady restaurant clients, a loyal local following, and a booth at the biggest event of the season. Frank Delaney, the grizzled mayor of Briar Glen, and the one-man band of its agricultural council ambled over with a clipboard. "Morning, Jessica," he said, eyeing the crates. "You entering the heirloom category this year?" "Sure am." Ellie brought the ribbon tomatoes and the zebra-striped cucumbers, Jessica replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "Max's carrots are going up for best in root." "Heh, you'll give the Webbers a run for their money. They've been gunning for this title since 2008. Good luck," Jessica laughed. "We'll take all the luck we can get." The crowds swelled as the day wore on. Jonah Brooks arrived around noon, wiping oil off his hands with a rag and sporting a lopsided smile. He handed Jessica a wrapped bundle. "What's this?" she asked. "Unwrap it." Inside the cloth was a hand-carved wooden sign, smooth and polished with the words "Hope Acre Farm," etched in clean, bold letters. On the back, he'd carved a tiny chicken and a tomato. "You made this?" Jonah shrugged. "Call it a housewarming gift. Or, I don't know, a permanent sign for something that looks pretty dang permanent now." Jessica blinked back tears. "It's perfect." The afternoon brought the festival parade, followed by pie-eating contests, sack races, and a petting zoo. Max ran off with his new friends from the 4-H club, and Ellie manned the booth like a seasoned vendor, explaining crop rotation and organic practices to curious townsfolk and a few visiting chefs. Then came the moment everyone waited for, the Harvest Competition Awards. The town square hushed as Mayor Delaney climbed onto the makeshift stage set up in front of the courthouse. "This year, we've had a bumper crop of entries," he said, tipping his hat to the crowd. "We've seen some mighty fine squash and some suspiciously large onions. But as always, we're looking for quality care and something that reminds us why we do what we do." He rattled off the early categories: best jam, best pie crust, tallest cornstalk. Then came the heavy hitters. Best heirloom variety goes to Hope Acre Farm. Cheers and applause broke out. Max jumped up and down, nearly knocking over a crate of turnips. Ellie beamed, her cheeks flushed with pride. Jessica made her way to the stage, heart pounding. Delaney grinned as he handed her a blue ribbon. "Well earned," he said, "and one more while we're at it." He turned back to the microphone. "This year, we're adding a new recognition, the Sustainability Innovation Award, for the farm that shows promise, resilience, and a commitment to the future of Briar Glen agriculture, and that goes to Hope Acre Farm." The second cheer was even louder. Jessica barely made it off the stage before people started coming over to shake her hand, offer congratulations, and place produce orders. Some were the same folks who'd laughed back in March. Jessica was loading empty crates into the truck when she spotted Clyde Rollins leaning on a post, chewing a toothpick and watching the festivities. She felt her stomach twist. They hadn't spoken since the water board ruling. He ambled over, glancing at the ribbons pinned to her chest. "Didn't expect this," he said gruffly. Jessica folded her arms, meeting his gaze. "Most folks didn't." He nodded, eyes fixed on the stand. "Guess I was wrong. About a lot of things." Jessica waited, unsure whether he was winding up for a jab or something else. Clyde sighed. "My cousin Ben says your tomatoes beat anything he's grown. Wants your advice on composting." Jessica allowed herself a slow, cautious smile. "He's welcome to stop by the farm. We've got extra bins." "Right," Clyde said. "Well, Keep doing what you're doing." And with that, he walked away. Jessica turned to find Jonah beside her, arms crossed. "Was that Clyde Rawlins giving you respect?" "More like a ceasefire," she said, "but I'll take it." As dusk settled over the festival, lanterns flickered to life and music drifted from the stage. Kids chased each other between booths, and laughter rang through the square. Ellie and Max ran the produce booth on their own now, tallying sales and organizing crates. They looked like they belonged, because they did. Jessica stood at the edge of the square, watching her kids thrive, watching her farm's name spoken with pride, and watching a town that had once mocked her now fold her into its fabric. Jonah joined her, his hand brushing hers. "So," he said softly, "was it worth it?" Jessica looked out at the rows of vegetables, the blue ribbons, her kids laughing beneath the festival lights. "We didn't just survive," she said. "We grew something worth keeping." And as the last notes of a fiddle tune rose into the night sky, the lights of Briar Glen shimmered over a farm that had once been broken, but now thrived, not just with crops, but with hope, family, and the strength of a woman who never gave up. And so, the farm that everyone laughed at, whispered about, and called hopeless, it bloomed. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't come easy. But day by day, row by row, Jessica Rayner turned a broken piece of land into something living, something lasting. She didn't do it with million-dollar equipment or a degree in agriculture. She did it with grit, with a borrowed shovel, with 2 kids and a stubborn heart that refused to quit. They called her foolish for trying. They told her to go back to Denver. But she stayed. She stayed when the coop was vandalized. She stayed when the water pump failed. She stayed when the permits were challenged and the whispers got loud. And you know what happened? The land stood with her. With every sprouting seed, every egg laid, every handmade sign at the Saturday market, the farm began to speak. And what it said was simple: we belong here. Hope Acre didn't just survive. It grew deep roots. Roots strong enough to hold through storms and sabotage, strong enough to carry a new generation. Ellie found her voice in poetry and soil-stained notebooks. Max became the youngest chicken manager this side of the Rockies, armed with clipboards, wide eyes, and the unshakable belief that every hen deserves a name. And Jessica? She found herself right there in the dirt, not just as a mother or a survivor, but as a builder of something real. Briar Glen, that tight-lipped town, couldn't ignore it forever. The same people who once turned their backs, they stood in line at her booth. They asked for her herbs by name, and at the Fall Harvest Festival when they pinned that blue ribbon to her stand. Well, it wasn't just about the tomatoes. It was about everything she'd sown: courage, faith, and a whole lot of heart. And maybe that's the lesson this story leaves with us. You don't need everyone to believe in you. You just need enough sunlight, a little faith, and the guts to plant your roots anyway. Because sometimes the best kind of revenge is a thriving harvest. So now it's your turn. Have you ever been counted out, told you couldn't do it, that you didn't belong? Have you stood your ground when it would have been easier to walk away? We want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments below, because you never know who you might inspire just by sharing it. And if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a time you had to fight for your own little piece of peace, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, not just for us, but so you don't miss the next story we tell. Because trust us, they only get better from here. Here on this channel, we're not just telling stories. We're remembering what matters. We're planting hope, and we're watching it grow. And now, so do we.